Good. So now we can talk about sapience. We've had we've had two forms of cognitive representation now. There is bodily imagination, which I call emulation, in which we imagine people and ourselves and intentional actions and intentional objects. It's all about bodily activity. The second system is language, which is quite distinct and separate. It involves discrete words that can be arranged in different patterns. It has quite different properties. And the properties of these two different systems are complementary in that each has strengths the other doesn't. Bodily imagination is rich, but it's analog, and it's continuous, and it's closely in touch with real action and real perception. In fact, it's barely separable, but it is separable. Language, on the other hand, is analytical and quite separate from the world. You don't confuse words with things. Put the two together and you get a new autonomous system, which is, as it were, entirely internal. It's imagination and internal language talking to one another entirely like within the individual's cognitive system. With these two together, thought becomes autonomous and independent, and that is sapience. So sapience arrives when language arrives, and language evolves in a social context, so that you can say that really sapient culture is prior to sapient thought. We're all born into a world where sapience is already going on, and we just pick it up. For the early hunter-gatherers and so on were inventing the early verbal systems, like the one I said of where things are, the location system, tremendously useful to be able to communicate information about where things are and what people are doing and how people are related. All these little verbal systems for representing these things, and they allow people to coordinate their activities effectively. And the chief way they do it is by organising the way they see things, by organising so that they have a shared vision of what's in the world. And it's against that background that any language makes sense. And different cultures have different ways of doing it. We take ours for granted, but even something as basic as the location system, where things are, in our Western languages, it all tends to be egocentric. You say it's to the left, it's to the right, it's in front, it's behind. It's all pointing out. In other languages, like native Australian languages, for example, it's decentered. It's more objective. Everything is done in terms of north, east, south, and west. Even if it's on the table, you'd say it's to the southwest end of the table, and as a result, their sense of direction is perfect because they're continually being reminded of where they are in space in a way that we aren't. Their whole sense of space is different. Their visual memory is far better than ours, and they have this whole thing of song lines, which is a mimetic system that is completely beyond our ken, but it's part of their system of sapience. So we learn to be sapient through participating in a sapient culture that is already going on. When a child learns to speak, then simultaneously they learn to think and to become an autonomous person. They hear and participate in the exchange between language and emulative thought, language and real action and real perception. They learn how these two different representational systems relate to one another, how you can use one to control the other and to reflect the other. They learn first through participating and collaborating with others, that then in due course they use the same methods to collaborate and control themselves, even when there's nobody else there. It's like Plato said, the thought is the dialogue of the soul with itself. So we use language to control what we do. We give, quite simply, we can give ourselves instructions and think about the actions that we're going to do. Ask ourselves how we're going to do this. What are you doing? That names the goal. How are you going to do it? The means and the ends. You divide things up into a rational sequence of actions, something that it would be very hard to do without the analytical power of language. Why are you doing this? It sets the actions in a wider context, so that if anybody asks you, you can give a responsible answer to the meaning of your action. And if we can't do all that, if we can't, then we aren't deemed to be acting in a voluntary way at all. There are some actions that we can't tell ourselves to do. You can't tell yourself to digest something, and therefore it's not a voluntary action. Similarly, on the perceptual side, we become aware of perceiving things, and we become reflective, and we're able to contemplate and analyze the things we see around us. And if you can't communicate what you see with others or with yourself, you're not really deemed to be conscious of it at all. So our emulative ancestors, who didn't have language, were aware of themselves, but they were just aware of themselves as social people. They were aware of themselves as having a role in their group and their own point of view, but they didn't have any sense of thought itself. They weren't aware that they were thinking, perceiving, imagining. They could do those things, but they weren't conscious of doing it. With language and with dialogue, we cannot help become aware of this new sapience. Sapience really is an autonomous system, and we become aware of it. There is what you say to other people, and there is what you don't say. You say to yourself, perhaps. You become aware of an internal space of dialogue that is not shared. So with that, you get a sense of interiority. So sapience, we have the sapient mind, and we think of it as in the head. And so our early sapient ancestors would have been tacitly aware of this. In due course, developing new language games, people start to talk about language itself, necessarily. You want to be able to say whether a statement is true or false, or whether somebody can tell you something. Annie knows that Eddie is by the river. Eddie is by the river is one statement. Annie knows it is a statement about the statement. And so with that, we start to develop mentalistic terms. He believes it. He saw it. He hoped it. He feared it. These are all statements about things that people might say. And the same kind of internalization process goes on here, so that we come to think of these terms as part of the private space. We have feelings and perceptions and sensations, and we really do. I mean, I'm not trying to say that these things don't exist, but this is how we come to be aware of having them. This is how perceiving as an activity in itself becomes real to us. Like our ancestors would see things, but they wouldn't recognize themselves as seeing things. Now we do, and we become aware of sensations. We have this whole rich inner life, or we like to think that we do. With meta language, it becomes possible, in some cultures at least, to develop this whole sense of subjectivity and private consciousness. I don't think this happens in all cultures. You know, it's a particular way of using language which has become highly developed in the modern Western world. I think, which in itself shows you the way sapience is something that develops and changes from one culture to another and from one era to another. And one thing we can be sure of is that it's got a long way to go yet. So now, I think I have given a very brief account of how we get from our natural food sharing ancestors of 5 million years ago to modern people who are self-aware and sapient and conscious and free in all the senses that we like to think that we are. Now, it's a very simple story, and I know that a lot of philosophers are going to find a lot of problems with it. So in the next one, I will try and deal with some of the philosophical problems.